So today we warmly welcome Dr. Laura Winter, who's a senior lecturer in education and counselling psychology and a practicing counselling psychologist at the University of Manchester. In her research, Laura is interested in exploring social justice across psychology, including its role in counselling psychology, educational psychology, and psychotherapy. In particular, the impact and relational inequality, welfare reform, and austerity on family and pupil well-being. Most recently, as I think we'll hear about more today, her work has been focusing on highlighting the relationship between therapy and small p and big P politics. So as in the title of a talk, let's talk about politics, and I will now pass over to Laura, if I can find her. Thanks very much for coming in and talking, being online and talking to us. Can you unmute, Laura?
I've unmuted, I am here. Can you make me co-host so that I can share my screen in a moment?
Make co-host.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you, and also for having me with you today. It's very strange doing these presentations from the comfort of your own home, but it's nice to see so many faces in the space. And I will just share my slides as I mentioned. There we go. Okay. So Mick Cooper was the person that invited me to speak with you today. And he invited me to speak with you about my research around social justice in particular. And you'll notice that this doesn't appear in the title of the presentation itself, but hopefully it will become clear as we go on how I see kind of the work I'm talking about here is connecting with the kind of broader social justice agenda that I've been involved with. I plan on talking for about kind of 40 minutes or so, hopefully leaving a chunk of time at the end for some questions if anybody has any, and hopefully some thoughts and discussion as well. I was mentioning to James just before I started talking, I've had some horrible internet problems over the past few days, so I'm very much hoping that I don't cut out midway through, but if I do, I will reset and rejoin you as soon as possible. And please do not laugh at whatever face I freeze on. I'm hoping it's kind to me. So firstly, just to give, some yellow things have appeared on the slides. I'm not sure what's gone on there, but just to give a bit of context of what I'm going to be doing. As I said, we're briefly going to start talking about social justice research. It's way beyond the scope of the time we've got here to kind of review that literature in full, but I do want to set the scene and give that as a bit of my starting point, really to provide the backdrop for what follows, which is a clearer focus on politics and therapy specifically. So I'm going to give a bit of a review of the literature that came before, but I'm going to spend the bulk of time looking at a recent study I completed, which looked at therapists' accounts of politics and therapy, so their experiences of that in relation to their work. And in the work I'm doing on politics and therapy, my aim really is to kind of draw attention to or encourage a focus on the political and how political engagement might feature as part of this social justice agenda. So I'm going to end the presentation with some of my kind of thoughts on what the possible implications might be, and also some questions that are still floating around for me, because this is all fairly new, for me at least, and it'd be nice to hear some opinions at the end. But essentially, I think that we've become fairly comfortable as counsellors, psychotherapists, psychologists with the term social justice and talking about it, and it's definitely increased in usage, but I'm not always sure that we look at what lies beneath. And it's a very broad, far-reaching term, as we'll see. I think sometimes we happily stay on the surface of the label of social justice, which can almost function as a catch-all term for being committed to being nice. And I think really what lies beneath social justice are various political ideas and questions of political action. So I really want us to become more comfortable talking about politics as well as social justice. And that we should perhaps repoliticize social justice within the professions. So to begin with social justice itself then, there's a I mean, I could spend half a day talking about definitions of social justice. There are multiple definitions of in the literature, most of which in counselling and psychotherapy and psychology draw on other fields to kind of to bring in political, philosophical, and kind of other disciplines knowledge within this. But the definition I'm using there is from a 2013 paper, where I said that social justice is both a goal of action and the process of action itself, which involves an emphasis on equity or equality for individuals in society in terms of access to a number of different resources and opportunities, the right to self-determination or autonomy and participation in decision-making, freedom from oppression, and a balancing of power across society. So that's massive. It includes an awful lot of very big words, and an awful lot of words that themselves need quite a lot of unpacking. And social justice has always been a core tenet of the field of community psychology, and certain branches and areas of the kind of broad counselling and psychotherapy traditions. Within applied psychology, which is where I'm located primarily, then there's been a growing recognition, I think, of the importance of social justice to our work. And this has been evident in the literature, certainly building since 2000 globally, and since early 2010s, probably in the UK. So as I said, I'm not planning on reviewing the massive field of social justice literature, but I think there's a lot of diverse stuff in there. And I've kind of, for the purposes of this talk at least, I've chunked it up in my head into three main strands. The first one being stuff that is social justice specific. So things that are labelled and badged as social justice in various different professions. So this is research that talks to counselling psychologists or educational psychologists or counsellors and psychotherapists and so on about this phrase, this term, social justice. Typically it's talking to professionals, this research, either trainees or qualified professionals. And there's tons of examples I could give. I've done some work in both counselling and educational psychology on this, but there are much broader literatures within that as well. But there's a second group, a second kind of section of work of the literature, which I think is potentially much broader. And that's about research and scholarship that's considering things that are related to social justice. It might not be explicitly using that term. It might be, but it might not be. But the authors do connect with, and the research is connected with some of those ideas in that definition of social justice. So, for example, this might be research with particular minoritized groups and marginalized populations. Much of the work of the trainee counselling psychologists I supervise at Manchester, my amazing kind of PGR colleagues, much of their research links in with this second strand of work. And the final category, as I see it at least, is kind of conceptual or review work. So not the empirical stuff, but the writings and the guidance and the frameworks on social justice badged as such. This is typically about training or practice, typically about what can we do, what have we done, what does this look like? Not necessarily kind of empirical work. What we see across all of these three categories of the social justice literature, as I see it, is that the political is there. So it's hinted at or it's inferred in lots of cases. There's talk about the socio-political context to our work or the influence of political decision makers and political powers. But there's not much direct explanation or foregrounding of what politics has to do with social justice. And also what politics is like for the practitioners in this work. And the next quote I wanted to share with you comes from the last category of work. It was a paper I wrote which attempted to outline some kind of simple social justice steps for practitioners, or kind of a good enough place to start, essentially. And I include this because I think it shows my direction of travel in relation to this social justice literature. So I said at that point that social justice in counselling and psychotherapy does not have to be something complicated or obtuse. And simply put, it is an acknowledgement that the work we do occurs in a socio-political context, which it cannot be easily disconnected from, and that therefore things like power, discrimination and oppression are important, and that this work can have political implications. Social justice work then becomes about remembering and articulating these values in practice. So now I'm considering more explicitly the political implications and the political part of what we mean by social justice and what the social justice agenda might be, and trying to kind of connect that and play around with what we mean by it. And the reason I connect the two, I guess, did at first glance seem obvious, but then I also did need to kind of question, well, why am I thinking this? And why am I not seeing the political always explicitly in these literatures? And I think it's because the ideas contained within definitions of social justice, so things like on the definition I gave before, equality, equity, fairness, all those things, they're all values which are structured through political systems. So if each of you in this Zoom session wrote down your definition of social justice, I imagine there would be variants. So some of you might emphasize more freedom from oppression, some of you might emphasize equity or equitable systems. But all of the things I'm imagining, or the majority of the things I'm imagining you come up with, are things that are normative values, are values which are structured through political systems in our society. That's the systems, and the political structures dictate what those look like. And indeed, outside of the social justice literature, there's the swathes of writing about therapy and politics, separate from the label of social justice. And I'm going to mention more of that in a moment. But there's this warning from Martin Milton and Charles Legg in 2000 about, we might think about a systemic focus, we might think about thinking about an ecological perspective, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're looking at the political structuring of those systems and the political nature of those systems. So a structural systemic focus can be apolitical in nature. But what do I mean by politics? What do I mean by that in the first place? And a phrase that I think lots and lots of other people, many people, have used when thinking about this is the personal is political. I imagine the majority of you, or many of you perhaps, have come across this phrase before. It's a well-known activist phrase associated largely with the feminist movement. And I think it's useful to consider the context of this phrase a little bit more, because I think for me it helps unpack why it's such an important idea for counsellors and psychotherapists and psychologists to think about. And it's often associated with the work of Carol Hanisch, and she was writing about women's therapy groups, and the fact that these were kind of therapeutic spaces viewed as personal sessions for people to talk about personal problems and develop personal solutions. But you'll see from this quote here that she didn't view these therapeutic groups as simply personal. So she said that, I believe at this point, and maybe for a long time to come, that these analytical sessions are a form of political action. I do not go to these sessions because I need or want to talk about my personal problems. One of the first things we discover in these groups is that personal problems are political problems. There are no personal solutions at this time. There is only collective action for a collective solution. I went and I continue to go to these meetings because I have gotten a political understanding which all my reading, all my political discussions, all my political action, all my 4 odd years in the movement never gave me. So it strikes me as really important that she's talking about therapeutic work. She's talking about problems that often get labelled as mental health problems often, but she's talking about them as political problems and political groups. And this kind of this rests on an understanding of politics which isn't just about electoral politics. It isn't just about the type of politics that we often hear the most about. And again, this is probably familiar to many of you, but this distinction between two interlinked understandings of politics that we need to understand, I think. So big P politics is about electoral, governmental, ideological party politics. Whereas small p politics denotes kind of a broader conception of systems of power relations and structuring of societal political experiences and actions, So often I think we only think about the former, but I think that the latter is very important to think about in terms of therapy, but also in terms of its relationship to the big P politics. So big P political action might be about lobbying your MP, it might be writing letters, going to protests, getting involved in public policy discussions. Whereas small P politics and small P political action is described as Hankins there as the way in which everyday decision making by individuals and communities can gradually, episodically change dominant hegemonic norms and understandings, providing new opportunities for social change. So this is sometimes known as quiet activism and kind of small P political work. And I do think the two interlinked ideas of politics are important to hang on to and to distinguish where relevant, as I'll talk about a little bit more. And I think it helps us recognise parts of our work that might be political in a broader sense. And a good example of this is in Carl Rogers' later writings and his work on personal power. And he talks in the opening of that text about how people had been telling him for years that his work was political, and he hadn't really got it. He didn't really know why or thought about it that way, but it was because he thought about big P politics. And when he thought about this broader definition, that was when he understood that yes, the work was political. And in my research on education, kind of in the field of education, I've considered the relationships between the personal, big P political, and the small P political. And I did a couple of projects, both of which linked into the impacts of austerity on families and schools. And some subsequent analysis I did of that data kind of looked at the interconnection between these things. And I think by considering politics as both small and big P, and by focusing on well-being and the personal as related to these two things, you start to look at the work that schools are doing in this context slightly differently. So in those projects, I was hearing from educators telling me about buying extra food for pupils with their own money, buying sanitary products, loaning families money to cover their electricity bills just for a short period in time, inviting parents as well as the children to breakfast clubs. All of this seemed to be small P political action in some way. So in the quote I put on the slide there, I said, if we ignore the political work and relationships in and around schools, we're doing young people and the staff working with them a significant disservice, and we obscure the real life practice in education. Emotional well-being and education are not only impacted by the big P political, they themselves are small P political. So this is about whether the action of professionals, in this case teachers, but we could think about this beyond, and I'll mention that a little bit later on, might be political work, just not with a big P. And as I mentioned, there is a broader literature on politics and therapy and the various connections between the two. So a lot of people have written about how politics and mental health or politics and therapy are inseparable, far too many people to cite on one slide, but a lot of people have written about that. A lot of people have written about therapy as a political activity, and recently, and the quote on the slide there is from clinical psychology, but it's been said in lots of disciplines that psychologists in this case should take a political stance in their work. There's also been writing, so Pete Sanders wrote in the Politicizing the Person-Centered Therapy book in 2006 about the various areas for consideration when thinking about this intersection between politics and therapy. And Nick Totten did a similar thing, thinking about the politics in and of psychotherapy and the psychotherapy in and of politics. And there's also been kind of specific kind of therapeutic models that have been put forward linked to this. So Avisar's work in Israel looks at politically sensitive psychotherapy. So there's a wealth of arguments and a lot of conceptual work and theoretical work on what this might look like. But alongside this, there are cautions. So Colin Feltham, for example, has written that politically motivated therapists are probably not explicitly bringing their agenda into their work with vulnerable clients, but that there is an unrecognized issue here that should be confronted. So if this is implicitly coming in to our work, then there's a caution, a warning about that. What does it mean for us if our work is political? So despite the wealth of evidence here, or sorry, if the wealth of kind of conceptual writings, there's still loads of questions. And there's some empirical work, so a little bit of work that's looked at practitioners' views. And interestingly, this first one was done in the kind of the wake of Trump's election in the US, and there was a survey done there around Democrats and Republicans and talking about politics in the therapy room. And the majority of psychologists in that study talked about having had conversations about big P politics in this sense with clients. So I think 87% of them said that they'd had those conversations. And then there's also other work that says that there's the majority of practitioners surveyed are saying that the therapy and politics are distinct. There's a large minority viewing politics as relevant, but the majority do not. But this left me, kind of after reviewing all of this, it left me with lots of questions about what this is like for therapists in their work. What is the political like in relation to the work that we're doing, and what a therapist's experiences of this in particular. So I did a fairly small qualitative project last summer that I'd really like to talk through with you. And the question I asked them was, how do therapists understand and experience politics in their work? So I did a qualitative online survey. 32 therapists completed it. So applied psychologists, counsellors and psychotherapists. So I think we had counselling and educational psychologists. Didn't have any clinical psychologists, I don't think, or beyond that, but both trainee and qualified practitioners. And I engaged with that data through a reflexive thematic analysis. And what I'd like to do is talk through the main themes that I constructed from that data and that analysis, because I think it raises quite a lot of interesting questions about how these two things come together in experience. So the first one, the first theme that I constructed was this sense that practitioners felt like they were swimming against the tide of politics and therapy. So a negative influence on the whole of politics on people they work with and on themselves, and that it's challenging really to work psychologically with someone who then returns to a problematic social and political environment. So here in this first theme, politics is kind of seen as an external force pushing in, something outside of therapy that is pushing in and impinging the process. And adding challenge. And the quote there on the slide, many of my non-private clients' issues come from poverty and are worsened by austerity. It's hard to encourage self-worth when their environment treats them like rubbish. And this is fairly typical of the sorts of things that people were saying in terms of the influence of political policies. So there was something about big P in there in terms of political policies and decision making and party politics. There are also small P political issues cropping up in terms of kind of social identities and power struggles, and also the relationship between the two was coming in, the relationship between big and small P. So clients and practitioners kind of experience the negative implication of unequal power relations based on social identities and of public policy and of the coming together of those two things. And secondly, and kind of in contrast to this understanding of politics being an external force, the work of therapists and psychologists was seen by participants in this study, at least, as inherently political. So it was, as well as this external force, there was something existing within the act, the profession itself. So within this, participants talked about feeling driven by their own politics. They talked about being aware of the political nature of both accessing therapy and professional help as a client, but also the political nature of them as practitioners having accessed or accessing training as a professional. And they also talked about viewing the therapeutic relationship itself as political. And this was massively tied up with the power relations within that therapeutic relationship. So some of this was about the role power that the therapist has by being in that particular role, and the client has by virtue of being in the client. So the dynamics simply based on their roles. For example, one participant I think talked about the contracting and agreement of two people within boundaries, but also because of the social identities of those involved in that relationships. So if we think about Gillian Proctor's work on power, then it's not only about role power, but also about historical power and social power. And both of these types of power are kind of illustrated in the quote on the slide there. So there's a power relationship between the therapist and client, with the therapist more powerful. Identity, cultural and economic issues, so race, gender, sexuality, class, permeate and shape the therapeutic relationship. So in this theme, the relational is political. So far we've had this idea of therapy itself being inherently political, so something within, but we've also had this idea of politics as something kind of coming in from the outside, beating in from the outside. And then in the next theme, we saw, or I saw, some concern entering in. So this idea that we have to park our impressions of politics at the door. If any of you incidentally have a therapy room door that looks as lovely as that, then I'm very, very jealous. But we have to park our impressions of politics at the door, was the next theme. And there was some concern. It was a very uncomfortable part of the work for some people. So the quote on the slide there, if a therapist can't be alongside their client due to incompatible politics, it can cause a rupture or weakening of the relationship. There was this sense that if we have a difference in relation to this, then that's going to be really problematic. So in some of their responses to the questions in the survey, there was a sense that if this comes up, it's going to be really hard and I'm not going to bring it up. So along those lines, the next quote, twice in 3 years, a client has raised politics. I was very uncomfortable in case we disagreed. So it's something that should only be raised by the client. But there's kind of a sense of, oh, what on earth do we do if it is raised by the client and we don't agree? So one participant explained this, as seen in the theme name, as we have to park our own impressions of politics at the door and concentrate on the client's experience. And they went on to say, this is not about our agenda, and so we need to be even more attuned to clients' needs and experiences without displaying any of our concerns. So these concerns within this theme seemed largely, although perhaps not exclusively, but largely, about the bringing of big P politics into the room. So party politics coming into things, or political ideology into the therapeutic space. And there was a kind of mixture of responses on that, but the overwhelming sense was that we need to leave it. We need to leave it, and if it comes in, then we'll manage it, but we're a bit uncomfortable about how to do that. And in the next theme, we see those kind of tussles continuing, I think. And this was all about professional ethics and politics and how we balance between these two things. So concerns were raised about how we balance our own politics and our own political views alongside professional ethics, and the need to account for our professional ethics and our own personal politics in the work we do. So this participant here said, I find politics very difficult to deal with in practice. I'm often torn between respecting the individual rights and beliefs of the client with what I can perceive as the danger of some kind of politics for the well-being of people in our society. So who are we serving here? Are we serving our client in front of us? Are we serving society? What about the balancing of our client's well-being alongside society's well-being and our well-being? And there were questions about, essentially, if you think your client's politics and political beliefs are dangerous, as in this quote, How do you handle that in the therapy room and within the therapeutic relationship? And the analysis here kind of suggests that practitioners were unsure about how to do this and found it a really complicated part of their work. Nevertheless, for some practitioners, and quite a number of responses within the research, then in order to be ethical, then they had to be political. So this quote on the slide, we have to face these things and be able to hold all of them for our clients. We are holding the political. It is scary and a burden and an ethical requirement. So the questions that came up for me here were around how can we be both ethical and political, and is political therapeutic practice ethical, and is ethical therapeutic practice political? So there's this balancing and this tightrope that comes up in relation to how we manage that. And the final theme that was constructed from the data was around this culture of silence and a lack of support and training. So the therapists that completed the survey kind of talked about this culture of silence in psychology and the therapeutic professions around politics. So they talked about taking part in relatively little training to equip them to handle this part of their work. So quite a few of them talked about engaging in diversity and difference training as part of their initial kind of practitioner training. They talking about some areas of difference on their programs, but they also talked about feeling quite unequipped, or actually as having drawn on previous careers to feel equipped. So some of them talked about having previous careers in education and youth work, in other things that allowed them to feel more grounded and able to handle this part of their work. And they reflected on the feeling of a lack of support and kind of broader recognition in the profession for taking part in this work, for viewing the political as relevant to their work as a therapist or psychologist. So I think the two quotes on the slide there are fairly powerful in illustrating this. The first one, psychology has traditionally ignored politics. There is a culture of silence, sense of trepidation in talking about these issues. Nutshell, it's a lonely process. And the second, the silence is suffocating because of course it impacts our work. So the people that took part in this survey were people that viewed, as I've discussed, viewed politics as relevant in one way or another, viewed it as impacting in one way or another, and felt quite isolated in how they managed that and unsure how to manage that. There was a feeling like they were kind of out on their own. So moving on then to think about what I kind of take away from that particular project before I kind of, as I said, before I end with some kind of implications more broadly. In terms of that project, I think my main conclusions were that therapeutic work is political for some practitioners. It's influenced by both the small p and the big P, and it was really useful in the analysis to be able to think about the different types of what they were meaning by political. What did they say to me about what politics meant to them, and how they saw that within their work. Therapeutic training did not equip them on the whole to know how to work with politics in their role, and left them with lots of questions. There's a feeling of being alone and unsupported on a broader level. And there's a particular difficulty around big P politics, explicitly entering into therapeutic discussions. And it really made me think, I don't know whether people saw it, I've mentioned Mick twice now, and I know he's not here, but Mick Cooper posted something ahead of the last general election. I know he said something on social media about big P politics at that time and his views on it, and it started a really big discussion about whether or not, as a therapist, it's okay to be vocal about big P politics. And that was kind of echoed, I think, in what I heard here about the particular difficulty of bringing that explicitly into the therapeutic space. And I think developing on the kind of conceptual and theoretical work I mentioned at the start around the interrelationship between politics and therapy, I think this gives us more of an idea of what it's actually experienced like for practitioners within their jobs. It's by no means definitive, and it opens for me more doors and more questions. And I've just put a couple of these questions here. Firstly, I've got this question about when we think about the connection between this project and the work I've done in education before. Can we think of the work as therapists are doing as small p political action, as quiet activism? Or does therapy just perpetuate oppressive systems, as many eminent people have written about before me? But how and when are we engaged in small p political action as therapists, and how and when are we not? Can you differentiate those and unpick some of that? And secondly, questions are still kind of floating around for me about this question of ethical practice and whether political practice is ethical and whether ethical practice is political. And I don't have any answers here, but I do think there's some interesting work happening in the social justice field. So there's recently been published some ethical guidelines for social justice work, which could be an interesting avenue to explore when we're considering the political more explicitly in our work. And as I said, I wanted to end with some implications. So I wanted to make this a little bit more tangible than I know my work and other work in the social justice literature sometimes is. And these don't just build on the particular project I've talked through today, but also build on my other work on social justice in terms of research, but also kind of my experience as an educator on the Prof Doc in Counselling Psychology at Manchester. And as I said at the beginning, my overall hope or aim, I don't think we all necessarily need to become politicised practitioners, but I do think we need to become much more comfortable with talking about politics. As I think we have done around social justice, and for us to really question what we mean by the term social justice, so that we don't fall into this trap of making it an empty phrase that is whacked on to every new study that is about being nice or talking to minoritized groups. I think we need to be cautious about what we mean by it and think, you know, if Ian Duncan Smith can use social justice at the same time as Amnesty International, then it can mean different things to different people. So let's unpack what that means. But more specifically, I guess, so this thing about diversity and difference training came up in the research, and it was actually really interesting for me, given my role at Manchester and the conversations I've had with the programme team there and the work we've done, because I think there's a real issue with some of the training that practitioners on initial counselling and psychotherapy training programmes and applied psychology programmes have around diversity and difference, and the fact that this is often very apolitical. It's often very stripped away of kind of this side of the work. And there are many issues with the term diversity in terms of disguising inequality, I guess. So I think we kind of need to shift this narrative to think about something much more active, to think about at Manchester we've reworked this around the name challenging oppression, discrimination and inequality. So there's something about being more active and also thinking about what we're doing within any input on this to ensure that people feel appropriately grounded to manage this part of their work. And I've already said a bit about this, but I think we need research and scholarship to kind of actively unpick social justice and consider politics in more detail. We have lots of questions about what this might mean for people. I didn't ask in the survey, I didn't ask people about the relationship between social justice and politics, because that's not really what I wanted to do in this study. But interestingly, it was kind of only mentioned by maybe one or two people who said something about social justice, that it didn't come up much, but it'd be interesting to think about this more. And the third implication I've kind of picked out here is I think, I like to think we're pretty good at looking at reflexive practice. We encourage reflexive practitioner models and so on. I think we need to apply this to the political selves as well. We need to think about our own privilege and our own positioning in relation to these political parts of ourselves. And I put there, so engage with peer networks, and I realized afterwards this is probably the most relevant to people who do see this as do see politics as part of the work, because I realized the participants in the study talked about feeling quite isolated and alone. But there are some peer networks around, you know, psychologists for social change, psychotherapists and counsellors for social responsibility. There are groups that are engaging with this. But that's kind of separate to my last point, which is about support from membership bodies. So one of the things that was in the study was around not feeling supported by membership bodies like the BPS and so on, to kind of support this part of the work, and this part of a practitioner's identity and development. So I think going forward, that would be something I would be encouraging in the future. So that's where I end the talking at you part of this afternoon, at least. I will stop my share at this point and hand back to James.
Great stuff, Laura. Really fascinating, and judging by the number of questions coming in, really thought-provoking as well. So thank you very much indeed. What I'll do is, there's been a good number of questions. I'll just try and kick off some that have come through that I thought might be good to talk about. The first one was, did Laura explore whether therapists share these thoughts with their clients, whether they feel it's possible, appropriate, or even necessary to discuss politics and its effects on the therapy with the client?
That is a really good question. It wasn't one of the questions whether they talked about it. There was a question about how they felt that politics impacted upon the therapeutic relationship, and there were questions about the impact on the clients, but there wasn't anything specific that kind of delved into that, and that didn't come out of what people told me. But I think that would be an important thing to kind of take forward in future studies, in my mind, whether or not, particularly given the reaction and the responses around this discomfort, this very strong discomfort, which seemed to sit alongside the feeling that what we're doing is political, but I'm really worried that someone's going to mention politics. There was something there that I think would be worth unpacking a little bit more. And I mean, I know there is a body of work around that, just to say, so there is stuff around kind of broaching in the therapeutic literature, but that's more about, that's less about politics more generally and more about broaching particular issues, such as broaching racism, for example. I know there's a whole literature around that.
Did the modality, this is a question from Natalie, did the modality of the therapy, whether it's psychodynamic, person-centered, pluralistic, impact on their views?
Not that came out of the analysis. I mean, I didn't specifically kind of measure and assess for that. But there was also it wasn't obvious, at least, that there were any particular relationships across the different qualifications even. So, you know, it seemed, I didn't see any patterns across counselling psychologists versus psychotherapists or anything like that. But I think I imagine there would be some differences. I think, again, that would be something that would be interesting to look at, because I know that, and I kind of mentioned this when I talked about the literature around politics and therapy more broadly, but there are some branches of counselling and psychotherapy that this is much more wrapped up with and is much more part of the norm to discuss, and there are some where it's much newer and much less common.
There's a few more people who were intrigued to discuss the diversity a little more. Rowan and Xanthi will be asking about, on the one hand, you know, the cost of training, the representation of counsellors, the diversity amongst counsellors, and, you know, that certain groups are not represented, and how that affects I know you talked about it a little bit. I wonder if you could expand a bit more. And another question from Alan, which kind of maybe links to it, about whether you noticed, or if you didn't find anything, would expect any difference between private practice clinicians and those who are not private practice.
Yeah, I didn't see anything different around kind of private practice or those that work in the NHS. I think the point about accessing training is really, really relevant, and I know is an ongoing conversation. and certainly as a counselling psychologist, this is particularly relevant given the amount people pay to study on the programme that I teach on. And across the country, you know, we're the only place where you've even got a chance of getting a scholarship, and that's typically only 1 or 2 people a year. It's massively problematic, and I think the participants themselves talked about that. So they talked about how their own politics, a number of them talked about their own kind of big P political views, but also their own kind of political selves and their own backgrounds and experiences, and how they were very aware that influenced how they connected with their clients, the fact that they were even in a room with clients. So they didn't just talk about, well, politics influences clients because it impacts who can come and see me free and who can't, and all of the structural barriers. They also talked about it impacting them. So there was an awareness of the privilege that is associated, and the systems that are excluding people from training in counselling and psychotherapy. Sadly, I don't have the answers for how we solve that, but I do think it was definitely something that was talked about by participants.
Mandy Carr would like to know a bit more about the people you interviewed, in terms of the mixture of gender, ethnicity, cultural backgrounds.
Yeah.
Whether you felt that has a role. I suppose, you know, inevitably any demographic factor would put you at a particular standpoint. Did you notice anything along those lines, or do you think that's important?
Well, in terms of ethnicity, it was fairly representative of, or not representative at all really, but it was fairly indicative of the problems with the broader profession, in that I think all but one of the participants, a very high number of the participants, identified as from a white background, whether it be British or other. I can't recall the gender split off the top of my head, but I know that essentially there was fairly limited diversity, at least on some axes. There were some, as many people do in terms of research, I left it open to people to contribute what they wanted in terms of their own identity and how they wanted to kind of identify themselves in terms of the research. And you know, it wasn't a quant project. I wasn't looking at any kind of correlations between any of these things, so I didn't measure and kind of look for that in my analysis. But I also was very aware that it was coming from a very privileged sample in many ways, because they're therapists, because they're white, and other factors also.
I've got an interesting question from Melanie Wyatt, I think. The question is, psychology is not the only field that has traditionally ignored politics, and she wonders whether this estrangement of politics is reflective of the role of small and big P politics in our everyday lives and relationships, the belief that politics should be avoided because it potentially leads to conflict and rupture, and whether we're just ill-equipped to talk about politics.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And I was thinking about this again recently, because I think, you know, my point about diversity and difference training, and all the other ways, I'm labeling it as that. I know that not all kind of courses refer to it as such, but often in curricula it's mentioned and described in that way. So if you look at the kind of standards that training programs are working to, then that's often how it's talked about. There's often not a requirement to get people to tussle and to talk about really hard to talk about things. So my fear about, and I kind of mentioned this at the start, but I can say more about it. My fear about the term social justice, and I am somewhat to blame, I think, for some of the increase in the use of the term, but my fear about the term is that sometimes it disguises things, and it means that people don't talk about the tricky stuff underneath, because we just say that this is part of the social justice agenda, and aren't we all great because we think about social justice. But I think Melanie's point is bang on for me, in that there is a fear about talking about some of the very complicated, divisive things. And I think if in training we're not, I mean, it's really tricky as a trainer. It's really tricky to get groups of people to engage in these conversations in a really respectful way, but that also gets those disagreements going, or at least gets things out in the open. I think that's really tricky. But if we don't do it, I think you're right that there's a kind of it's representative of broader society where we don't have a dialogue and debate. I think Emmy van Deurzen talked about this in an interview with the Psychologist a few years ago, that we don't have, or we're not used to, we're not comfortable with that dialogue, with that disagreement in a respectful way, and in a way that actually allows us to tussle around with these things. But I would like us, at least in counselling and psychotherapy, if not beyond, to try and talk about these things, because I do think it might help scratch beneath the surface a little bit.
Right, we'll have a couple more because we've had like I said, a lot come in. Johnny Hutchison would like to ask, to what extent do we as practitioners sadly need to rely on small p politics because of the punitive implications of big P activism, such as punitive investigations of fitness to practice by HCPC, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, if I've understood the question right, I think that I do think there's a risk that the kind of small p political work that goes on is letting the powers that be off the hook, right? So there's one of the things I talked about when I did the work in education was the fact that teachers are doing this stuff in schools, in that example, potentially makes it easier for local authorities, for governments not to give them more money because it's being done by schools. So that there's an argument that really people shouldn't do this stuff because it perpetuates. But I kind of think, there's an argument that a lot of what we do as therapists is problematic for that reason. The question is what we do in the meantime, before we get to our marvelous utopia where there's no social inequality. Then what do we do in the meantime? And I'm not sure withdrawing some of that small p political stuff is the answer. It's also very everyday. I also think it's, in human geography literatures that talk about small p political actions, there's stuff about, stuff that goes on in communities that is just part and parcel of life that's and in the same way, I think the stuff that we as counsellors, psychotherapists, psychologists do that's really bound up with just who we are and what we're doing. And I think that's probably a good thing. I don't know whether that answers that question exactly, but those are some thoughts.
Yeah, and it touches on something that Alan Wardle's mentioned, which I'll bring up, which is whether, and I'll aim it a bit more at you, whether you think, or whether the profession should be more involved in big P politics, given what we know about working with clients. I suppose it's the other side of the coin, really. Yeah,
there was a hesitant yeah. So I think when we've done some work, when we have gathered some views, it's worth speaking out. I know some of my colleagues, I don't know whether they're here at the moment, but we talk at Manchester about making the research kind of count that we're doing. That there's no point in lots of people doing lots of research on very valuable things. I'm using research as an example, but practice equally so, on really valuable things that illustrate the problem with big P politics, and then just it's sitting historically on a shelf now, kind of open access online, that probably nobody reads. There's a question with what we do with that. What do we do with this knowledge? And I do think we have a responsibility as citizens and as professionals to contribute to those debates and discussions. The work that colleagues and I did on the impact of the bedroom tax was then used by the Greater Manchester local authority in terms of looking at the impact of that particular policy was having on children and families. And I think we do need to engage in those discussions. However, I think the problem is that so many of us are not entirely equipped to do that, because it's not what we've been trained to do. So this is where I think the kind of feedback loop comes back in. I'm just starting a project at the moment with colleagues in the States that hopefully is going to look at how psychologists are getting involved in policy work and their experiences of that. I think there's a broader question about how we equip people to do this work, but the short answer, I think, is yes, that I think we need to get involved in all areas of politics, big and small.
Well, on that positive note, we will wrap it up. Before I tell you what's coming next in this series, let's just all unmute and give Laura a wonderful round of applause for a fantastic talk today. Thank you very much indeed.
And my internet. I'm going to give my internet a round of applause.
I mean, it's so thought-provoking this. I wish we could all go to the pub after the seminar, as we don't the word, except because I don't fancy buying around for 132 people. But it's been really great and fascinating. Coming up next, I decided before we started that I'll give the next talk in the PROS seminar because we don't have anyone lined up. And I'll be talking about the paper I have in press, looking at the psychological impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on NHS healthcare workers. So hopefully something of interest there for some of you. The paper should be out by the time the talk comes around, but look out for announcements on Twitter, psych_row, email if you want to be on the list, keep an eye on the website, usual stuff. But for today, it's been brilliant. Thanks once again, Laura. Wonderful talk. Cheers.
And I think there are a few people asking James about slides. If people want to email me for slides, or I can email them to James, that's absolutely fine.
There you go. Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great stuff, Laura. Really interesting, really interesting.
Right, I'm going to go and get a brew, but thank you very much for having me.
All the best.
Take care.
Bye-bye.